Every single Xenoblade game produced thus far had a Switch version. From the 2 new titles in Xenoblade 2 and 3, to the remasters of Xenoblade 1 and Xenoblade X. And that's not even counting the additional side stories of Torna the Golden Country, Future Connected, and Future Redeemed. Heck, Torna even had its own physical release, meaning that if you bought physical copies of every Xenoblade title released on Switch, you're up to 5 games at this point. Now, I adore the Xenoblade series. I have ever since I picked up the first game on a whim in the final days of the Wii, and I haven't looked back since. That first game was a technical marvel. A generation later, and Xenoblade X's only competition on Wii U in terms of scale was The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. But on Switch, something happened. We went from Xenoblade X running at a locked 720p on Wii U, to Xenoblade 2 and 3 averaging about 540p docked, with drops below that. Handheld barely managed to scrape out 480p with plenty of drops down to 360p. With the exception of Xenoblade X Definitive Edition, which ran at or near 1080p docked and 720p handheld, the rest of the Xenoblade series fell well short of not only Xenoblade X on Switch, but the Wii U version as well. And when played handheld, they regularly ran at a lower resolution than the very first game had on the original Wii. In fact, Xenoblade 2 on Switch was occasionally a match for Xenoblade 1 running on the 3DS. Outside of Xenoblade X, image quality has been a problem for this series on Switch. So naturally the question is, can Switch 2 help? There is no official Switch 2 update, so how far can backwards compatibility take us on these extremely demanding games? Well, I went back to each of these titles and tested them out anew to get some fresh resolution counts so that we can find out the state of Xenoblade on Switch 2. Let's get the outlier out of the way first. Xenoblade X is, as I said, the one Switch Xenoblade title that doesn't struggle with image quality. On Switch, it utilized dynamic resolution, but spent most of its time at or around its target of 1080p docked, 720p handheld, with an additional pass of FXAA anti-aliasing. Naturally, on Switch 2, it simply maxes out both of those dynamic resolution windows and is now locked to those numbers while maintaining its original 30 frames per second. A patch to get it up into the 4K range or running at a higher frame rate would be great, but as is, Xenoblade X looks great. But now let's jump back to the first Xenoblade to have released on Switch, way back in its launch year of 2017. Xenoblade 2 is very clearly a game built before the Switch specs had really been set in stone. Rumor is that Monolith was basing their expectations for the Switch on the specs for Sony's PlayStation 4, and really had to push to get Xenoblade 2 running on what the Switch wound up being. The game is making use of incredibly high-quality character models, materials, post-processing, and even a real-time volumetric sea of clouds. It is wild to see this in a Year 1 Switch game, but as a result, the game had notoriously low resolution and the frame rate wasn't the most consistent. As expected, the Switch 2 clears up the frame rate no problem, and maxes out the resolution in docked and handheld mode, but what exactly is the resolution window on this game? It's always been somewhat hard to tell because it constantly drops resolution. Well, on Switch 2, Xenoblade 2 runs at 720p docked and 576p handheld. Both of these are treated with a temporal form of anti-aliasing, and then treated with a sharpening filter. The final image, though an improvement over Switch 1, remains very degraded by that sharpening filter. I do think docked manages to look alright, but handheld is still pretty rough. Given what this game is trying to do, running it at a higher resolution and removing the sharpening filter would be transformative, and it would likely hold up as a native Switch 2 title. The story for its expansion, Torna the Golden Country, is the same, 720p docked, 576p handheld. Though to my eye, the sharpening doesn't seem quite as aggressive, perhaps giving Torna a slight edge over the base game in terms of image quality. After Xenoblade 2 and Torna came a remaster of Xenoblade 1. While characters and material work were all updated from the original Wii release, the game's Switch performance placed it near or occasionally even below the resolution of the original, so perhaps there's a reason Nintendo chose to call it Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition and not Xenoblade Chronicles HD. The resolution spread was similar to Xenoblade 2, though anecdotally, it seems like it never quite hit the lows of Xenoblade 2, especially in handheld mode. On Switch 2, Xenoblade 1, like Xenoblade 2, now runs at 720p docked, 576p handheld with temporal anti-aliasing. Unlike Xenoblade 2, it does not use that aggressive sharpening filter, resulting in a much cleaner looking image. Its new content, Future Connected, matches those same metrics, and of course the frame rate is now perfectly locked to 30 frames per second, though frame rate was never as big of a problem for this one as it was for Xenoblade 2. Xenoblade 3 seems to have learned a lot from Xenoblade 2. The raw technical ambitions are reined in somewhat with an adjusted art style. The resolution is still low, averaging 540p docked on Switch 1, but it does tend to stay right around that number rather than fluctuating wildly as Xenoblade 2 had done. Image treatment has also been upgraded with a temporal upscaling solution that resolves a cleaner image than either Xenoblade 1 or 2. It is a visually more stable game, even if the resolution leaves plenty to be desired. On Switch 2, the docked resolution is boosted to the expected 720 and locked in place, but handheld shows a peculiarity compared to the other two games. It maxes out at 480p rather than 576p. This appears to simply be a change in the dynamic resolution setup for handheld mode. Now, to some degree, it actually makes more sense than 576p, as 480p represents the same resolution scale relative to 720p as 720p does relative to 1080p, so the handheld resolution is scaled in line with the docked resolution. Still, it means that compared to Xenoblade 1 and 2, Xenoblade 3 currently has the worst resolution when played handheld on a Switch 2. Its expansion, Future Redeemed, operates with the same metrics. The Xenoblade series as a whole, with perhaps the exception of Xenoblade X, is in an awkward spot on Switch 2. Objectively, both image quality and performance are improved, but because no official update patch has been released, all of these games are still subservient to their original dynamic resolution windows. Now, in fairness, we have seen evidence buried in the code to suggest the possibility of a 60 FPS mode in Xenoblade X. This may imply that plans are already in motion to provide Switch 2 enhancements for at least that title. As Xenoblade X is the game least in need of the update, I have to assume those plans would also extend to the other three. These games are beautifully crafted in terms of visual design, with Xenoblade 2 specifically pushing techniques well beyond what was done elsewhere in the series. Switch 2 could finally let us see these games the way their developers at Monolith likely always wanted them to be seen. In the meantime, if you're looking to revisit or play these titles for the first time on Switch 2, I'd recommend sticking to docked mode. The locked 720p isn't awful, and is certainly better than when we played these games originally, but handheld mode remains rough, especially in Xenoblade 3 with its lower max resolution, and Xenoblade 2 with its sharpening filter. That being said, Xenoblade X is fine. Maybe everybody should just play Xenoblade X. It's really good. But that's all I've got for today. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like and maybe subscribing to Nintendo World Report TV. You can find a whole lot more on NintendoWorldReport.com, and if you'd like to chat with us about this or anything else Nintendo related, you can find a link to our Discord in the description. My name's John Reardon, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.